Good morning. Welcome to Alternative Currents. I'm Bella Johnson, your host. Going through the February edition of the Utne Reader a few days ago, I came upon an article called The Nature Channel, an interview with forward-thinking biologist Rupert Sheldrake, and excerpted from an exciting new book, Twilight of the Clockwork God, Conversations on Science and Spirituality at the End of an Age, by John David Ebert, published by Council Oaks Books out of Tulsa, Oklahoma. I am indebted to Utne Reader's senior editor Jeremiah Creedon and Council Oaks for putting me in touch with Sheldrake's interviewer and author of Twilight of the Clockwork God, John David Ebert, who graciously agreed to be interviewed on today's show from his home in the San Francisco Bay Area. Before I introduce John Ebert, however, let me inform you that today's show is indeed live, and you will be given the opportunity to speak with this author directly, following Alternative Currents' usual protocol after our break at the half. So sit back, relax, and enjoy hearing about some groundbreaking information guaranteed to get you thinking. John David Ebert is an editor spent 6 years as an editor with the Joseph Campbell Foundation. He's written and spoken extensively on the relevance of mythology to contemporary society and science in national journals, reviews, and public speaking tours. Ebert has appeared frequently as an expert on mythology on A&E's Ancient Mysteries. He's a freelance writer, now working on his second book about the myth of science fiction cinema, and also teaches part-time at the Astrological Institute in Scottsdale, Arizona. I am absolutely thrilled to have him on the show today, and let's welcome him, and we'll get going with our interview. You there, John?
Yes, I am. Good morning.
Good morning. I got your book yesterday.
Great. That always helps.
Oh, I was so excited, and I just have to convey that to the listeners. This is really an amazing culmination of thought. And I have to convey that excitement on. Can you tell us first, John, how you came up with your title? I know you go into that in the introduction, but the origin of clocks and so on.
Yeah, well, when I wrote the book, I was looking for, of course, a catchy title, and just sort of the thing that occurred to me was I wanted to capture something of a kind of culture cycle coming to an end, and so I thought of, Wagner's Twilight of the Gods, that great opera in which he discusses these great mythological historical cycles. And then I also wanted that mechanical image that we're shifting out of, and that the book is addressed to these interviews with people whose work in the sciences has led them to a vision of an organic, living vision of the cosmos. And so I wanted an organic image that was also was simultaneously mechanical and organic. So I came up with this idea of Twilight of the Clockwork God, and the way in which this links to the whole sort of thematic organization of the book is that the mechanical clock was really the first great Northern European machine, and it was invented by these Gothic monks around the year 1300, right about in there, the 12th century, between the 12th and 13th centuries, and the reason that they invented it was primarily the first clocks didn't have dials on them, and they were just meant to be heard, and they were designed to sound the canonical hours of the days so that the monks would be on time for their prayers. But at the same time, they were kind of laying this out as a primary organization not only of the day, which later led to this kind of organization of the day by the factory, during the 19th century, but also primarily to this cosmological image that the entire universe might function with the harmony and beauty of a machine, of a sort of mechanical clock. And this idea of the solar system as a mechanical clock was picked up by these monks who were also simultaneously, scientists. They were interested in thinking about machines and the properties of magnetism and light and so forth. And it got passed up into the intelligentsia. Kepler picked this idea up, and then later Newton and so forth. And that's the image that we're shifting out of nowadays.
Yes. Can you speak to what you put forth about Spengler's second religiousness?
Yes, so this is linked in with this idea of sort of an age that's passing away and a new age that's coming into being, because simultaneously with the age that's passing away, the age of this sort of tyranny of mechanistic thinking in the sciences, which began to sort of crumble and fall apart, once you start getting Einstein in there and the revolution in quantum mechanics at about the turn of the 20th century, right then you begin to get this Twilight of the Clockwork God. And all of that took place at the turn of the century, and just at the end of World War I, Oswald Spengler was this great German intellectual who wrote The Decline of the West. And in that book, he sort of predicted, he compared our civilization to a number of civilizations in the past, and the primary one that he had in mind was the Greek and Roman civilization. And he said there are a number of parallels which, with our civilization, which if you sort of line them up with the classical Greco-Roman civilization, what you can do is make certain predictions that will come to pass. And for example, he says, we are today in our civilization where the Romans were at about the time of the disintegration of their republic with the rise of the Caesars, about the time of Julius Caesar, where Republican politics were breaking down, and there was more and more violence that was coming into the forum and was coming out into the public, and people were getting into these offices through, assassinating people. You sort of see all this in that PBS series, I, Claudius. But at the same time, this shift out of these sort of democratic ideals into this sort of struggle for power, you also get this shift into what Spengler called a second religiousness. And by second religiousness, he means that at the beginning of the Greek civilization, the classical civilization, there was this fundamental piety, this sort of the human relationship to the cosmos is fundamentally religious. And then gradually over time, as the culture evolves, it moves out of this religious phase into a kind of philosophical phase. And, we think of the Greek classical invention of philosophy. The Greeks sort of invented that. And then this decline into materialism, and Spengler characterizes the Romans as obsessed with materialism, and in many ways they're very comparable to the sort of American pragmatism, materialism, and technology, whereas we've sort of lost our sense for the poetics of culture. And then it gradually declines, and it reaches a point where the culture cannot tolerate materialism any longer, and it begins to exhaust that paradigm, and then it begins to shift into a new second religiousness. And at the time of Rome, this was going on. You had astrology coming in. You had these mystery cults popping up all over the place, all over the world at that time. And that was the second religiousness that Spengler predicted was on the way for us. Coming up, he predicted that it would be like in the second half of the 20th century, which is about dead on as far as I was concerned. So I sort of linked Spengler's idea of the second religiousness with this idea of shifting out of the mechanistic, materialistic vision of the cosmos, and scientists sort of coming to a realization of new spiritual currents at work, and that second religiousness sort of creeping into the sciences in the realm of the intellect. So that's what I had in mind anyway.
I also like the comparison that William Irwin Thompson makes of the cultural and social structures of the Middle Ages being similar to what's happening now. Can you speak or comment about that?
Yeah, that's another parallel that's very similar to what Spengler's talking about also. Thompson says, cultures come, Spengler's idea was that, cultures come full circle back to where they started in the beginning. And Spengler's date for our culture, for the birth of it, he says, was right about the year 1000. So these cultures tend to last about 1,000 years. And William Irwin Thompson is this brilliant culture historian who has never read Oswald Spengler, but he has very Spenglerian tendencies in his thinking, and that was one of the things that attracted me to him. Sort of compares our culture, where we're at now, to a kind of neo-medievalization, a kind of return to what was going on in the Middle Ages with this sort of Dark Ages that is in the process of being ushered in by electronic culture and popular culture. He says the shift out of literacy, there's been a decline in the standards of literacy, and people are sort of, leaving the book behind, and you find fewer and fewer references. If you look at the history of film, or if you, turn on television programs, you find fewer and fewer references to books or to literacy, or to people even respecting the idea of having a mind as itself an ideal. And he says this is very similar to the sort of shift back to the Middle Ages, where you have these large populations who were mostly illiterate and who didn't know how to read, and the electronic culture is sort of bringing that disliteracy back into being nowadays. And also these sort of corporations with their sort of the sort of corporate mentality where you have this sort of single center where it's almost as though you have a fortress with, that's guarded by secret armies, and instead of knights, you have, SWAT teams or private armies or high security systems, and guarding these places where you have centers of information and you have these sort of medieval lords of information, and so you have all that going on. And Thompson saw this sort of remedievalization of the society going on. So that's what he sees right now.
So you also mentioned Terence McKenna's model, some kind of model ending in the year 2012. I didn't quite get what that model was. I was working so hard to just get through the book, and we'll go back and read every word because it's just amazing stuff. But can you talk about that?
Yeah, that's another idea that's kind of linked in with these historical cycles. Terence McKenna, who died actually just last year of cancer, but he was a really fun and original thinker, and he sort of came up with this idea of what he called the time wave. And the way in which he arrived at it was by studying the I Ching, and he sort of mapped, in some way in which I don't understand because I don't understand computers very well, he sort of mapped this into software, translated it into software, and created this system that he called the time wave, where if you look back through history, he's got these little waves. Every time there's a sort of novelty that you get, like, for example, the invention of the printing press, or the invention of, democratic ideals in the end of the 18th century, or rather reinvention, you come to a spike in the time wave. And he saw this sort of wave going, gradually winding down and down as it approached the year 2000, until you get to the year 2012. He saw this the wave just dropping right at that, and just, sort of falling off the chart, and he called that the sort of zero-point or end of history. And he said, isn't it interesting that the whole Mayan worldview was built on this idea that the year 2012 was, for them, one historical cycle where the entire universe would come to an end. And I don't think the universe is going to come to an end in 2012, but it's a kind of interesting way in which you can arrive at these different maps of culture and history independently. And so I'm sort of fascinated by that, the way in which the human mind imagines history and historical cycles.
And this number 64 thing, 64, that comes up around the I Ching and other significant events or systems?
Yes, the number 64, I asked him about that, and I'm not a mathematician there, but I guess it's 4 squared? If you go, mathematically, the sort of root of it is the number 4, and that, of course, evokes Jung's idea of the mandala, where you have this fourfold rootedness that's sort of at the core of the psyche, and it's also carbon. The carbon atom has a valency of 4, and you can find that. And if you just sort of keep doubling that, 4 plus 4 is 8, so you go 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. And it seems to create this sort of basic structure, and you find that there are 64 hexagrams in the I Ching, and then at the same time, I guess there are 64 codons in the genetic sequence, which are the sequence of base pairs, possible combinations for the base pairs. There are 64 of them. And he thought that that was an interesting coincidence also, that there's this kind of resonance between what's going on out in the macrocosm, the sort of Chinese vision of the Tao, and what's going on in the microcosm of the human organism. He thought that that interesting connection is a kind of revival of the old, nowadays outmoded idea of the human being a microcosm of the macrocosm. So that was the idea that he was talking about there with 64.
Oh, good. Thanks for clarifying that for me. What do you feel unifies the subjects that you interviewed? What do you think the common denominator, if any, would be?
The common denominator was my starting point, which was mythology, and that's where I started. I sort of graduated from the university system with a BA in English and came across the works of Joseph Campbell and just became really fascinated with the study of mythology. And the more I read in Campbell, the more I learned about myth. But Campbell now was somebody who wasn't really into science much. He didn't really keep up with the developments in the contemporary world. He sort of stopped reading books after 1945, anything published after that date. But he would drop these references to certain scientists that he had come across who had ideas that sounded to him like certain ideas in mythology. And one of those scientists was, of course, Rupert Sheldrake. And he mentions in one of his little books how Rupert Sheldrake's idea of morphogenetic fields sounded a lot to him like the Hindu conception of